Thank you, Chair. I move that the Standing Committee on Public Accounts request the following documents from the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care: the financial transactions, as well as the line-by-line claims history of Dr. Chris Mazza over the time period of December 2006 until present, and that the information be broken down into manageable chunks by month or by year.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Agreed.
Agreed.
Can I have a friendly amendment as to if they want to submit it electronically so that it's easier for searching, that would work too?
Okay. Okay, so we'll vote on the amendment that it be submitted electronically. All in favor of it being submitted electronically?
Agreed.
Agreed. Carried. Motion as amended carried then. Okay, and then we have our witness for this morning, Sharon Grauer. If you would like to come forward, please. And to confirm that you received the letter for a witness coming before the committee.
I did.
Very well, and I understand you're going to... Please have a seat. And our clerk will swear an oath with you.
Morning, Ms. Grauer. The Bible's in front of you there if you just want to. Thank you very much. Ms. Grauer, do you solemnly swear that the evidence you shall give to this committee touching the subject of the present inquiry shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Very well, and I believe you have a short opening statement, so when you're ready, go ahead and do that, and then we'll have questioning by the parties.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to appear before your committee. As you know, my name is Sharon Grauer. I'm a partner of the law firm of McCarthy Tatro LLP and have been since 1984. I work in the business law group of the law firm and have a subspecialty in health regulatory matters. I also teach on a part-time basis as an adjunct professor at the Institute of Health Policy Management and Evaluation at the University of Toronto and have done so since 2001. I am here because of my former role as a director of Ornge, then Ontario Air Ambulance, from February 2005 to October 2007. My role as a director was in my personal capacity and not on behalf of my law firm or the university. I thought the experience of being a director on an organization providing emergency medical care would provide a unique opportunity to apply my skills and also provide me with greater insight about board governance from the perspective of a director as opposed to that of a lawyer or a teacher. I understand that my name was given to Dr. Mazza in 2005 by Lynn Golding of Faskins as a possible candidate to join the board of Ontario Air Ambulance as it then was. I know Lynn professionally as we work in similar areas of the law. I was interviewed by Dr. Mazza in January 2005 to see if I would be an appropriate candidate and was then invited to join the board. The other directors on the board during the period I was involved included Rainer Beltzner, Dr. Mazza, Luis Navis, Rick Potter, Dr. Bob Lester, Hamish Smith, Lauren Crawford, and Enola Stoyle. As we were a new board to a new entity, the tasks that we dealt with primarily included mission, vision, and values analysis, governance documents including letters patent and bylaws, policies, CEO compensation arrangements, establishment of committees, board education, and the performance agreement with the Ontario government. I also briefly served on the audit committee of Ornge that was established in 2006 and attended 3 meetings of the audit committee. The other members of the audit committee were Rainer Beltzner, Dr. Mazza, Maria Renzella, Enola Stoyle, and Hamish Smith. As a director, I was paid $1,000 for each board meeting I attended, and as a committee member, $250 an hour for committee work. During my tenure on the board, Ontario Air Ambulance changed its name to Ornge, and Ornge was the only entity of which I was aware. It was a not-for-profit entity. Excuse me. It was a not-for-profit entity not a charitable organization throughout my tenure as a director. Sorry, I have a frog in my throat. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Very well. We shall start with the opposition. Mr. Cleason, I guess we'll have 20-minute periods and then see what's left after that. So
Sure. Thank
go
you.
ahead, please.
Thank you, Ms. Grauer, for being here with us today. We have, as you know, had a number of directors from the board appearing before the committee over the last number of weeks. And the reason for that is that given the history of what happened with Ornge, certainly as a committee we're very concerned about how things could get off the rails the way they did. The board of directors had very specific responsibilities, and so it's of interest to us to know where the board of directors was as this corporate entity began to grow. You joined the board in 2005?
Correct, February.
Okay. And when did you resign?
My last board meeting was early October 2007.
And I use the term resign. Did you resign, or were you asked to leave, or were you asked not to come back? How did that happen, if you could just tell us?
Mine was sort of an interesting departure in the sense that we had 2-year terms, and there were also board reviews done by outside consultants. And the chair of the board asked to meet with me, and I met with him on September 11, 2007. And part of the purpose for that meeting was a debrief from the board consultants. And at the end of that meeting, I was advised by the chair that I would not be serving a subsequent term. So in effect, technically, I think mine was an expiry of my term, but I was not invited to serve a subsequent term.
Very diplomatic in terms of how you described that. Were you surprised that you weren't asked to continue?
Yes, I was, and I wasn't expecting that. So yes, I think I was surprised. I felt pretty low when I left that meeting because I had worked hard during the 2.5 years, and there's a learning curve with any organization to understand how it works, and I sort of felt that I was just up the learning curve basically. So I was
referred to a
disappointed.
debrief from the board consultant. This was an outside consulting firm that.
Yes.
What was it about that debrief? Do you recall any specific concerns that perhaps were raised by these consultants that would affect your reappointment?
I don't believe I got any details out of the board debrief. What I was basically told is that Dr. Mazza did not want me to continue on the board.
Did you ever think that perhaps the reason you weren't asked to come back is that you were working too hard?
That frankly didn't cross my mind, but I think I know at times Dr. Mazza did not appreciate my asking questions. Not that I thought I had the most penetrating questions in the world, but I seemed to irritate him by asking questions.
Can you give us an example of some questions that...
Sure. In the board meeting, I believe it was either end of December, early January of 2006, Dr. Mazza made reference to an opinion that Faskins had rendered. And being a lawyer, naturally my ears perked up, and I thought, gee, that's a good thing for me to take a look at as a lawyer on the board. And the board had been constituted, by the way, to have a pretty interesting distribution of skill sets. There wasn't any duplication when I was on the board. It was a real cross-section of skill sets. So I asked if I could see the opinion, and Dr. Mazza was not very happy with that request. And I remember at the board meeting, the other board members finally said, just get it to her. And I did get it a couple of weeks later, and that was an example of attention, if you like.
Can you tell us what that opinion was about?
Sure. It was an opinion given by Lynn Golding, and it was contemplating setting up a different structure than just the one not-for-profit entity. As I recall, it was going to have a charity at the top, a not-for-profit under it, and a for-profit under that. So 3 boxes stacked vertically. And I think that the plan was to turn the not-for-profit into the charity. And then the reason one had to interpose a not-for-profit in between is that the legislation at the time here in Ontario included the Charitable Gifts Act, and it prohibited a charity from owning more than 10% of another organization for more than 7 years. So the legal fix was to always interpose a not-for-profit, because the not-for-profit could own the for-profit. And that was, I guess, the very start or preliminary thinking of ways in which Ornge could perhaps get more revenues, because there was certainly concern that Ornge should look for other ways to obtain revenues and not be 100% dependent on the government.
And so after reviewing that opinion, did you have any concerns, or did you raise any issues at the next board meeting regarding that opinion or the proposed restructuring?
I did not. It seemed like the opinion was fine from the standpoint of the legal hat. Then we started to, the other meeting I recall where the issue of possible restructuring of Ornge took place was on a board retreat in April of 2007. And at that board retreat, Dr. Mazza went through some discussion about what might be coming. And I think there may have been only one other board meeting at which I was at before I was off the board, so I did not get an opportunity to really delve into the grand plan that was being formulated.
So that overview that Dr. Mazza gave at that
my departure and the problems that have surfaced with Ornge, I was curious to find out when Ornge became a charity as opposed to a not-for-profit, and it appears that that happened in 2008.
Okay. So in that April 2007 board meeting that you're referring to, by that time, Ornge had already received another opinion from Fasken Martineau dated February 21st, 2007. And this was provided by Mr. Giorno. It relates to the creation of NewCo and ShareCo, and it speaks rather extensively about what is referred to as a proposed $1.6 million loan to ShareCo from Ornge. Do you recall that transaction?
I do not know anything about that, nor did I ever see that opinion, or nor was it referenced.
Okay. In that, just out of interest, obviously the question had been asked about the appropriateness of Ornge advancing a loan of $1.6 million for startup to the commercial corporation, as it's referred to. And in the memorandum, there are some serious concerns that have been raised by Mr. Giorno regarding the appropriateness. He speaks about fines up to 12 months imprisonment or both if in fact this transaction was found to be offside. It's just interesting that an important memo like this would not have come to the attention of the board. In your time on the board, did you feel, I mean, I know you told me that you got into trouble for asking questions. Were there other circumstances that come to mind where you saw things happening or decisions were taken where you felt you didn't have the appropriate backup information so that you as a director could make a reasonable decision on this?
There is one that sticks in my mind, and it was in 2006. And this was a board meeting at which the topic of rebranding of Ontario Air Ambulance came up. And it really didn't directly involve financial issues. It involved the branding and the image of the organization. And at that board meeting, consultants who had been engaged by management to advise on what would be an appropriate new name and what would be the image and rollout strategy for rebranding spoke to the board. And this is probably debatable because I suspect some management would say that's their prerogative, but I happen to think that something as significant as branding really was a board decision. And I felt at that meeting that the decision had already been made and we were simply being informed of it and then being asked, because of the requirement to have member approval to amend letters patent, to approve it. And I happened to mention at one of the board reviews in 2006 to the chair that I was not happy that that had been the approach, that I thought that the board should have been more involved in the decision making. And I went so far as to suggest that at the meeting, if they were determined to do that, they should basically say Ornge, formerly known as Ontario Air Ambulance, because I thought it was important to draw the connection, but that was not taken up, so it just became Ornge.
What was the reaction of the chair when you expressed your opinion about that?
He just thanked me for my input. He didn't say much.
When the discussion came about for the restructuring, that first restructuring where discussion came about for that first commercial corporation, for-profit entity, did the issue of transferring executive salaries into that new entity ever come up?
In the April retreat meeting?
Or at any time, really, while you were on the board?
It certainly wasn't before the April. The only time it might have come up was April, and I don't remember that specifically. I simply remember that sort of Dr. Mazza had a board to draw on, and he was drawing, sort of a graph of what might the new organization look like, and it was more talking at the governance level with the board and what would happen to the boards as opposed to getting into the executive side.
When you, and I'm assuming that you've seen the media and the reports on this, and you've seen the spawning of the numerous for-profit companies.
Yes.
And the fact that salaries of executives had been shifted out of the not-for-profit into the for-profit, and as a result, these salaries were no longer being disclosed. What was your reaction when you heard that?
I was quite shocked and surprised because you can imagine in my involvement there was one entity, it was a not-for-profit, and then to read about the number of entities, I thought that was quite amazing actually. I still wonder, how Ornge evolved into that, as I'm sure everybody here does too.
Other people, executives as well as directors, have commented about Dr. Mazza's personality and how engaging he was and dynamic and charismatic. And then it turned out that we have this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde creature who, with all of the spoken good intentions, really ended up leading the destruction of a very important organization. Did you ever, in the course of either when you met him or as you observed him as a member of the board, did you ever have a sense that Dr. Mazza has some difficult parts to his personality and may just be making some decisions that are inappropriate or at least questionable?
I think Dr. Mazza is a complex individual, and when I first met him and was first on the board in 2005, he is very charismatic, and he came with a very impressive background, as you know, an emergency medical physician from Sunnybrook, an MBA, having been the brainchild behind the idea of centralizing the air ambulance facilities in Ontario. Very persuasive, energetic man. And it was, I can tell you, a real privilege in the first year on the board of Ornge Air Ambulance, because it had such an energy and such a mandate to centralize and get this whole project up and running. And I think the highlight for me was the February retreat in 2006, or it was end of January 2006, when the board was together for sort of 2.5 days and really focused on, what were we going to be, how are we going to do it, and it was just all the good stuff. I can tell you that when Dr. Mazza's son Josh died, it profoundly affected the man. I do not underestimate that. I hope none of us ever have to go through what he went through. I remember attending with the chair and Finola Stoyle the funeral, because we were trying to support Dr. Mazza. And he was very broken. It was a very emotional funeral. And I'm sure that has had a profound effect on him and will continue to. The tension, I think, was that he had a vision, he had a desire, and we wanted to continue to help support, get that continuing mandate to run air ambulance going and developing. And so, there were instances where questions would be raised of succession planning. I think it would be imprudent of a board not to think about succession planning. What happens if something happens to your CEO, especially a CEO that's so pivotal to this organization? And we kept coming back to, he had the vision and the interest to do this, so we kept supporting him in his role as CEO. So there definitely are sort of stresses in his personality. And one example I remembered in preparing for today early on was, again, I think it was in 2006, the board was presented by Louis Navis with a balanced scorecard that we would use to evaluate CEO compensation. And I personally hadn't seen a balanced scorecard before. So what was done at that board meeting is we asked Dr. Mazza to leave the room while the board had a sort of in-camera session talking about the proposed evaluation matrix. And I kept asking questions of Luis because Luis was our compensation expert on the board, and the time flew by and it was about 45 minutes. Well, when Dr. Mazza came back in, he was extremely upset that we had taken so long because he couldn't understand what the problem was. And so I remember saying to him, this isn't about you, this is about the board learning what's the appropriate thing to do to measure compensation, because he was not a happy fellow that he had been excluded from that for so long.
And we are out of time, so we'll move on to the NDP. Ms. Jelinek.
Thank you. Welcome to Queen's Park, and thank you for coming. My first question is sort of your impression as to you're joining a not-for-profit healthcare organization on a board, and you're paid $1,000 per meeting. Did back in 2005 any trigger at all that how many you've dealt with in your work as a lawyer and as a teacher? You've dealt with many healthcare organizations. None of them pay their board members. How did you handle that part?
It's a good question. I wasn't expecting any compensation when I joined the board. I was doing this not to be paid. If I wanted to earn more money, I would have stayed practicing law because my hourly rate from Ornge was substantially less than what I could have done by sitting in my office. So, it was something that was simply proffered to the board at large, that this was what Ornge was going to pay its board and its committee members. The substantial difference, I think, is in my practice dealing with healthcare organizations. The hospitals are all charitable organizations. They have to be in order for their foundations to be able to give money to the hospitals, because foundations can only give to other qualified donees. And as a director of a charity, you cannot receive any remuneration. It's contrary to all the fiduciary duties. So that's the legal explanation why organizations like hospitals and their directors receive no remuneration. Whereas this was a not-for-profit. It was not improper legally for that. And I presumed that this was some kind of recognition of the amount of energy and work that would be taken by directors. So it was like an honorarium in my mind.
Okay. And do you know where it came from?
Oh, I assume it came from Ontario Air Ambulance.
No, I meant who decided that this not-for-profit healthcare organization was going to pay their board of director to attend meeting?
I believe it was from Dr. Mazza.
Okay.
What was your yearly compensation then?
It's a good question. I thought this might come up, and I actually went back to my tax returns. Give me a second. I'll find it, but it was around, it varied. If you average it, it was below $5,000 a year. I think the first year it was around $3,000, the second year around $5,000, and the third year around $6,000. And it came up to about $14,860 in total for the time I was there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So some of the, let's take you back to the board retreat in April of 2007. You're a member of the board, you're a member of governance, you know what governance is, you teach it in university. Governance sets the strategic direction. They decide where an organization is going to go, but you are telling us that it was Dr. Mazza who was telling the governance where the organization was going to go. Could you explain the disconnect here?
It's an interesting dilemma here because the organization was founded at the behest of Dr. Mazza and his work to try and centralize the air ambulance services in the province. And I think he lived and breathed this mandate. And so I think he had the desire to continue to evolve and try and grow the organization. And so he took it upon himself to develop that strategy. I have subsequently very much wondered about governance. And my own view is that perhaps we had an upside-down governance structure. Because most times you have, in the not-for-profit world, members who then elect directors, who then elect officers. And in our case, we seem to have the CEO recruit the board and decide who got to stay or not stay on the board. And we had a closed model of membership, which means the directors and the members were one and the same. And that's not an unusual structure to have that, but having the CEO in the pivotal role of inviting people on the board and then having them not stay suggests to me that the governance perhaps was inverted.
I'd agree. There was like some knowledgeable, high-profile people, such as yourself on the board. Nobody clued in that this thing is upside down. The governance should be setting the strategic direction, should be directing the CEO as to where Ornge should go, not the other way around. Was this ever talked about?
Well, I don't think it was as blatant then as perhaps with hindsight it may have become, because it's an interactive process. There are many, powerful, excellent CEOs who interact with their boards and put forward ideas. It's not unusual in that respect. But, the kinds of topics we dealt with when I was on the board were not that unusual or difficult, right? They were CEO compensation arrangements, which, by the way, during my tenure, Dr. Mazza's salary was in the $300,000 range, so it was not out of whack. The performance agreement, which Ornge had outside counsel assisting on, and which was a negotiated document, and Dr. Mazza did get the input of the board in it, and so it was in the early days more interactive. Which I think is normal. But I can remember, too, my last meeting with the chair, and my final comment to him, and I don't know whether it was a sixth sense or what, but when I learned I was not going to be on the board, I said to him, "You have a strong CEO, you need a strong board." And that was my final comment to the chair, because I was always worried about the balance of you need a strong board to interact with a strong CEO.
During your time on the board, were you aware of any communication with the ministry? Was either through the performance agreement, through the giving of the budget, did you know if there was any line of communication as to what was going on in this brand new multi-million-dollar transfer payment agency versus the ministry?
Certainly around the performance agreement, there was an active role, again, by management with the ministry. They were negotiating it. Dr. Mazza was very much hands-on with that role in negotiating the performance agreement. But other than that, I can't. And also at the very beginning, of course, when the assets were rolled out into air ambulance, and Faskins was involved in negotiating for air ambulance that asset transaction to legally roll the units out of the ministry and into this new company. So there was interaction there. But on a regular basis, except for sort of those two items, we didn't see much interaction with the ministry.
When the ministry transferred the budget, they transferred it to the board, not to the CEO. How was that handled?
Well, we had outside accountants who were auditors. We had an audit committee. We had financial statements. And, we did what a board, I think, normally does, which is hear reports from the CFO and look at the financials and, ask questions if we had any.
Did any question ever come from the ministry to you as in to the board?
No.
No? Did you ever have any questions for the ministry from the board?
No.
So no relationship at that level whatsoever?
None.
Okay. And when the performance agreement was presented to you, was there any issues as in, well, we're not happy with this thing, or we really had to negotiate this hard, or I think we have something good? Like, what was shared with the board at that level?
Well, we each were given a copy of the agreement, and I think we each read it. My recollection of the primary focus for the board was on what the performance standards were, which I think were in a schedule to the agreement, and were we going to be able to meet those to ensure continuous funding, because it would be a very short life if we went offside those performance standards and not get subsequent funding annually.
So you really understood that in order to continue to have funding, you had to do what was in your performance agreement, and that if you were not to do what was in your performance agreement, the government had ultimate control to say, you're not getting
Correct.
any more budget anymore.
Right. Right. So we were very targeted on making sure that as best we could, those indicators were all met.
Mm-hmm. And you also understood that the ministry had ultimate power to make sure that you continue to exist or not.
Yes, my recollection is there are provisions in the agreement that if there were breaches of those standards, they could choose not to fund.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've read the article that was dedicated to you in the paper as to ex-Ornge director describes stunning requests for her resignation. You've read the article, I take it?
I have.
And how accurate is it?
Fortunately for me, I was on page 19 of the Globe. That was the front page, and that was dedicated to Enola Stoyle. Enola was on the board and also asked questions. I remember one situation where I think it was the beginning of discussions about the foundation, J-Smarts, I think it's called. And she was, I thought, doing a good job because she asked, do the objects in air ambulances, letters patent, give the organization the power to do this? Is it part of its objects? Because, well, this isn't going to be the case for much longer once the new not-for-profit statutes are proclaimed in force. Presently, we still have old-fashioned objects for not-for-profit and charitable companies, which limit what they can do. Mm-hmm. And Enola, I thought, had asked a good question. And I was trying to also help her with that in the board meeting. And somewhere in the process, Dr. Mazza got quite upset with that direction. And it was after that board meeting that I recall he asked Enola to stay behind. And I don't believe Enola came back to any future board meetings. So I don't know exactly what happened, but I know she resigned in January of 2007. Or her resignation was presented to the board as that. And I have a feeling, knowing what happened to me, that perhaps for face-saving reasons this was presented as a resignation. But I believe on the article in the Star that or the Globe, I'm not sure which now. The Globe. That she was asked to leave.
She was asked to leave because were you there during the meeting where Dr. Mazza was talking about taking money from Ornge to start up the not-for-profit the charitable J Smart?
He certainly was talking about setting up JSmart. I don't think we got to the level of detail about where the money was going to come from, but it wouldn't surprise me that it might come from air ambulance. And I guess the discussion was, did it have an educative effect? Was this organization going to help reduce injuries among young people by educating them and therefore avoid having to do airlifts of injured young people, in the sense of, the educative role of going around trying to encourage people not to take high risks in sports?
You had the role in Ornge. You were there. Some of the people that stayed all the way to the end. You knew Dr. Mazza. You were there when his son passed. You saw the changes in him. And then you know why we're here today. It didn't turn out so good, did it?
No.
Can you help us understand what's your best guess as to what went wrong?
I think it's probably, and you probably have a sense of this from all the hard work you've done, it's not any one factor. It's got to be a number of factors. It's the personality of Dr. Mazza in part, because he's such a dynamic person who wants to achieve something. It's the terrible, unfortunate things that have happened to him personally with his son. It's a desire to try and find more than one source of funding to operate the organization with. And we all know that, the budget is, the Ontario government has a big deficit and that it's hard for more funding to go to healthcare. So I don't think the board thought it was imprudent to look at the possibility of alternative funding sources, because it would take some burden off the government and give some additional support to the organization. But I think perhaps some of the advice given and relied on might have been questionable, in the sense of forgetting that you're dealing with a not-for-profit organization and you're dealing with, I guess in 2008, Forward a Charity. There are people who, in my experience, are very fine lawyers in the for-profit world, and yet the way our for-profit charitable world works, there's other rules legally that apply to them, and it's not an easy thing to take your skill set on the for-profit side and move it to the not-for-profit charitable side. Sometimes when you try that, you lose sight of what's important on the for-profit charitable side, and perhaps there's some of that in this as well, that maybe some of the advisors came from the for-profit side and didn't appreciate the need to be extra careful in the ramifications on the for-profit, not-for-profit charitable side.
We have about a minute. Continuing with that same vein, what would you have done differently if you could have gone back in time and told your old self, listen, watch out for this, or you should ask more questions about that? What areas would you have liked to ask more questions about or done differently?
I really don't know how to answer that, because I haven't seen any of the opinions or legal work that was done after I left. And that whole structure evolved after I left, so it would be really kind of disingenuous of me to try to even hazard a guess. I suspect if I had stayed on the board, I would have kept on asking questions and probably gotten myself into more concerns. But I just know from having worked a while in the not-for-profit charitable sector, it's a very special sector, and you have to be very cognizant of the special rules around it. Also, primarily the Canada Revenue Agency. I'm not a tax lawyer, but fortunately in my firm we have got some wonderful tax lawyers who do know this area and have helped guide me. And these creatures are there in part because of the Income Tax Act in large measure. Not-for-profits are not supposed to accumulate surpluses. They're supposed to use the money for their purposes, and charities are obviously to use their money for their charitable purposes. So one of the things I think I could say I would have questioned was, is the purpose for which the money of a charity was being used in line with the Canada Revenue Agency rules? That would have been one thing I would have asked.
Thank you. And if we could go to the government members.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming here today, Shannon, and I know it's not been easy for you. I just would like to start with, I've heard your testimony earlier, and what came out was you were told that you cannot continue on the board because Dr. Matza doesn't want you to continue. So tell me, at that point, did you ask, well, what do the other board members think? Because surely something like this cannot be the decision of one person on the board. There's got to be unanimous consent if you're going to fire somebody. I'd like to get your perspective on what that dynamic was.
It's a good question, because legally and technically, if I had wanted to put up some kind of rearguard action, I would have asked for a members' meeting and then asked for the members' input, because members are the ones that appoint and terminate directors. But in the environment, that probably, it would have been an interesting thing to do. I did not think to do it at the time. What I did think to do afterwards was I reached out to the third-party consultant who had done the last 360 board review and asked if I could see just my result. I didn't want to see anybody else's, but see what the other board members had said about me. And they said it was confidential information to Ornge, and they would have to get consent from Ornge to release it to me. And when they followed up, they could not get the consent. So to this day, I don't know if I was a good director, bad director, or indifferent as far as my fellow board members.
Okay. And so what does that illustrate about the relationship between the board and Dr. Mazza, the fact that one man could decide who continues on the board and who doesn't? What did that illustrate? How well, to me, I'm trying to understand that one incident. What does it say about the board's ability to govern?
Well, I go back to your colleague's comment about governance, and my answer that I think in hindsight, it looked like an inverted governance model to me.
So I understand that it was an inverted governance model. My question, I guess, then is, what was the board doing to correct that? Because clearly you were aware that the governance was upside down while you were one of the board members.
I don't think I was aware until after. I think it's my reflection upon the experience and what's happened subsequently. I think the meeting at which I was told I was no longer wanted on the board, it did come as a surprise to me, and I felt, as I mentioned, fairly low about that. And I think that was one of the things that has led me to the conclusion I mentioned. But I don't think while I was a director, I thought we had an upside-down governance structure. I thought we had a very strong CEO, and that the board, was trying to interact accordingly.
So can you tell me why, when you were on the board, you didn't think the governance was, well, maybe not as strong a word as upside down, but that perhaps it wasn't as strong as it could have been?
Well, bear in mind...
and I'm not talking about your role, because clearly you were among the ones who was doing your duty. I'm just getting a sense of the entire board. So this is not about your performance.
So the board at large, bearing in mind that during my tenure I attended 10 board meetings, 2 retreats, and I think there were 3 quick board phone calls. So that's the subset of time we're talking about. And there were different approaches by directors. Some were asking questions, and others were more listening and evaluating. But I think each one, and as I come back to the January 2006 board retreat, each one was very committed to trying to do a good job. And I remember in that retreat we had a third party leading the retreat to help the board in its educative role. each person getting a couple minutes to talk about what they thought their role on the board was. And, people were referencing their various skill sets and what they would try to do to make sure that air ambulance did the right thing. So it wasn't readily apparent that the board was somehow failing in governance during that period. It was a dynamic between a strong management and a board that was learning the ropes, so to speak.
So with the Enola Stoyle incident, did you trigger on that perhaps she didn't go voluntarily and that the resignation, as you said, was face-saving? Was that kind of apparent to you at the time?
I was quite shocked when Enola didn't come back, and I believe we had one quick call shortly after she left, and that's when I found out that she hadn't gone voluntarily. And maybe in hindsight I should have said something at the board. I did not, because I figured it was sort of a private thing, in a sense, between her and the CEO.
Were there other incidents like this where Chris Mazza took decisions on his own and then the board just sort of either didn't question him, or what I'm trying to get at is, I guess, was the board enabling this behavior? Because when you didn't question him and say, listen, I had no input in Enola not coming back. I am an equal board member as you. If anything, I am your boss in many ways. And I never had a chance to weigh in on whether Enola should continue or not. Did you not at that point enable Chris Mazza's behavior?
I suspect in hindsight you're right.
And so would you say, and I'm not speaking particularly to you, but in general, do you think the board didn't carry out its governance duties as it should have and enabled Chris Mazza to do this sort of thing?
I can't make the quantum leap. I mean, on that one issue, I think it's a good point you're raising. As far as governance in general, I thought the board tried very hard to deal with governance of the entity. What I wonder about, too, in terms of just general governance is, and this is something I'm starting to raise with my classes as well because it bothers me, and I'm not sure it's exclusive to Ornge, is the idea that every 3 months a group of people get together with a board binder that they've read and ask questions of management, and it feels to me more like you're catching up because you're being briefed about what's happened as opposed to being in the front of the wave or the curve and setting the agenda.
Fair enough. What do you think was the relationship between Dr. Beltzner and Mr. Beltzner and Dr. Mazza?
It was very close, and I think that Mr. Beltzner, at the time that Dr. Mazza's son passed away, felt the need to step in and really support Dr. Mazza, and I think it got closer as a result of that. And because of that closeness, do you think there was an independence? Was he able to carry on his role as the chair and have Dr. Mazza accountable to the board? I think he could. I don't know enough about what's happened from fall of 2007 onward because my last communication with him was in October of 2007, but while I was involved, he seemed to be able to wear those two hats. So my last question before I turn it over to my colleagues is, at the end of the day, and I know you really appreciate this because your comments have suggested that you were there to protect the taxpayer, because this was hard-earned money of people who are flipping burgers somewhere that was being used. With hindsight, knowing everything you did during your tenure, do you think the board did a good job of protecting the taxpayer? It feels a little awkward to say, self-serving that we did a good job, but as I mentioned at the outset, the tremendous energy and optimism and what seemed like a very fine plan. Sorry, that wasn't my question. In hindsight, did you feel the board did its
You were there to
Well-
protect me and every other taxpayer in Ontario
Well,
and their funds.
I tried my best during the period I was on the board. I don't think there was anything that I ever saw that suggested there was so-called shenanigans or whatever going on during the interval of February 2005 to October 2007. And the point where there were descriptions being raised of a possible for-profit operation, it was in its infancy, and it was something that the board thought worth doing to look at ways to take some of the pressure actually off being solely reliant on the government for funding, and that didn't seem to be an incongruous thing to do.
Okay. So I guess I should just say, knowing everything that we do now, not just that brief period that you were on the board, but you've been following this.
Yes.
And you knew the players, so I just want your honest feedback.
Well, I'd love to be able to give you a general statement, yes or no, that they did a good job. I think it's premature for me to comment on that because there's an ongoing investigation. There's work being done still by this committee. And if it turns out that some of the allegations are in fact true, it'll be a tragedy, very much so. And the answer to your question will be no, they didn't do a good job. On the other hand, if there are other explanations, then maybe they did an adequate job. Obviously, there have been significant issues raised which give everyone pause to be concerned about what happened.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Grauer, for being here. I just want to follow up a little bit. You talked about the issue of compensation of Dr. Mazza, and there was a 45-minute session with the consultants, and at the end of that, you were presumably fairly convinced that the $300,000 range was a reasonable remuneration. Do you remember if that included his medical director stipend? Were you aware of this issue, that there was this part of his salary as well?
Can I just make clear a slight differentiation in what I said earlier? That meeting didn't involve consultants. It was Luis Navas, who is a board member, because of his compensation expertise. And we weren't at that meeting actually addressing the quantum of compensation. We were addressing the matrix for how we would address compensation at a subsequent meeting. So the setting of the salary was to be based on the matrix we were looking at. And it was really just factors. In fact, I have a copy if you're interested to see the matrix. So those two were separated. When we did get to compensation, no, to my recollection, I did not ever know about the additional stipend for the medical director.
But the actual amount that you were presented with, you felt at that point was reasonable?
Correct.
Were you also involved in any discussion of expenses for Dr. Mazza during the time you were on the board? Or did you sign off on any expenses that you recall?
I certainly did not. I don't recall discussions about expenses with, I think, one possible exception. I remember discussion at some point about directors possibly going to directors' school, the Institute of Corporate Directors, and that potentially Air Ambulance or Ornge would pay for that.
I see. And then you did not take advantage of that
No.
personally?
Correct.
That was the only conversation. Now, in relation to this issue of the sense that the Ministry of Health, the Government of Ontario needed other revenues to support Ornge, how was this presented to you as a board? Did this come from Dr. Mazza? Was there any communication from the Ministry of Health urging Ontario Air Ambulance to look for other sources of revenue?
I believe it came from Dr. Mazza. That's my recollection, and I don't recall anything coming from the ministry.
Did he provide some budgetary figures to show that there was some shortfall in terms of service delivery and funding available from the ministry?
I think in a general sense my recollection was that he thought there would be a need to do more services, and the organization couldn't necessarily count on additional funding from the government, and therefore as sort of prudent planning we would need to potentially look at other sources.
but it wasn't specifically related to some additional service or some other component of the service? You don't remember any specificity in terms of why this revenue was required?
No, I think it was really the general envelope concept that, there were many things the organization was doing, the EMAT services and, the emergency medical hospital that could be deployed, and I think has been to help out in the field for emergencies.
So at that point, you never got any hint that there was any sense of personal enrichment or some sort of increasing remuneration for board members? That never occurred to you?
I can honestly say I did not see any of that.
Thank you. Did Dr. Mazza ever give any opinion, or did you get any sense of his relationship with the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care, with the Emergency Health Services branch? Was there any sense of how he was dealing with the ministry, or?
My recollection is that he was very vested in having a good relationship with the ministry, and that he sort of took that relationship on himself to make sure that he knew as much as he could what the ministry wanted, and that he would report back to the board occasionally that all was well, that sort of thing.
During your time on the board, did he ever present the idea of owning aircraft, of purchasing aircraft of any sort?
I think again at that retreat in April of 2007 there may have been mention made of that, but nothing substantive, just sort of bearing in mind this was a very preliminary indication to the board of what he was thinking and what might be done, and I think there may have been some discussion there.
Was there any questioning of him as to the rationale?
Again, I can't really remember the details because I haven't gone back to my notes from that board meeting. But I think there was, my recollection as best I can is there were certainly some questions from some of the finance team, like the members of the board that had a finance background about how that was going to happen. For some reason, Hamish Smith comes to mind as somebody who weighed in on that.
Do we have time on this round? Or
You have a couple minutes left.
Okay. Well, actually, Hamish Smith, that name was new to me, and I'm wondering, he was on the board the whole time?
No, he was only on for a part of the time, and then he too resigned, and the notice that the chair sent around was, and I have a copy if you would like it, basically that he resigned because he was going to be in some sort of a business venture that might put him in a conflict of interest with Ornge. Now, I don't know the details of that at all, but obviously as a director, I think he did the right thing. If he spotted a conflict of interest, he felt that he had to choose one or the other, and he chose to leave.
And Mr. Crawford, again, Lorne Crawford, that was not a name I was familiar with. Was that individual on the board while
Yes, he was on the board the whole time I was, I believe. And he was a lovely man. He came from the northern part of Ontario, and he was picked, I don't know, I presume by Dr. Mazza, but he was picked because of his experience in the forest industry as a businessman and his knowledge of things in Northern Ontario. And again, the board seemed to have been put together with thought to have representation from different interests. And he was a delightful man.
When you left the board, he was still there?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Well, that's it for now. Thank you.
Very well. We'll move to the opposition, and you'll each have 5 minutes for a second round. So, Mr. Please.
Thank you. I'd like to just go back to your comment about the dismissal of Ms. Stott. And if I understand correctly, that took place, she was essentially dismissed after her meeting with Dr. Mazza. Is that correct?
I assume so, because I remember walking out of the board meeting and Dr. Mazza asked her to stay, and it sounded like a rather difficult discussion as I was leaving, and she didn't come back.
I find it odd that a board member could be fired by the chief executive officer. Have you ever experienced that on any other board?
No.
Is that something that, with your knowledge, can in fact legally take place?
No, it cannot. You're right.
With your experience, why would you not have challenged that as a director with fiduciary responsibilities?
It's a good question. I think it was partly because it had happened and Enola was moving to a LIN board, and I'm not sure it could have been rectified. I could have certainly made more of the issue, but by doing so, I'm sure I would have shortened my tenure as well on the board, and I'm not sure what's in the best interests of the corporation, which is obviously my role as a director, to act in the best interests of the organization. Is it better I should raise issues with respect to that and know it's probably not remedial, or is it better I stay on and try to do my job?
Well, that is a fundamental question, isn't it? I would have thought that as a director, an independent director, that the responsibility you have is to ensure that governance is done right.
Mm-hmm.
This was a very early indication of something very dysfunctional in this organization. The executive director was hiring and firing directors who ultimately had responsibility to oversee his work.
Correct.
This is a fundamental problem. Do you ever recall a decision coming to the board that was recommended by the executive director that the board turned down?
Do I ever recall a
recommendation
by the CEO?
By the CEO that was turned down.
I can't think of one off the top of my head. It would have been rare if it happened.
The conclusion that I come to after many witnesses and hearing from former directors is that this board was essentially a rubber stamp for Chris Mazza and Rainer Beltzner. That is not the role of the board, would you agree?
If you're correct, yes, I would agree.
What we're trying to do through this committee process is to identify what went wrong so that hopefully we can come forward with recommendations to ensure that things don't happen again the same way. Oversight is, or the lack of oversight, is why we find ourselves here today. And the board of directors had that responsibility. The Ministry of Health had the responsibility, ultimately. It's very clear from the Auditor General's report that the Ministry of Health failed in its oversight responsibilities, and it was a very quick response on the part of the minister to, in her words, fire the board and fire Chris Mazza. And of course, that is the sacrificial lamb, or they are the sacrificial lambs now, to absolve the ministry. We don't, as a committee, we won't allow that to happen. But there is a fundamental failure on the part of the board of directors to do their job, as we see it, or certainly as I, as a member of this committee, see it in terms of that lack of oversight.
And your time is up, Mr.
Almost
Cleese.
up.
It's up, Mr. Cleese.
Thank
so
you.
we'll move on to the NDP. Ms. Jones.
Well, kind of in the same train of thought. All right, so there was no communication between you and the ministry never came to the board to see in its oversight capacity. Then we have a board that has no membership, that doesn't get elected by a membership. It gets selected by a CEO and hired and fired at will of the CEO when they suited his purpose. And we know that the same structure is still happening in transfer payment agencies at the Ministry of Health right now. There are boards that does not have membership. There are boards where people are chosen and appointed without any democratic process. Are you worried that there could be other Ornges out there?
Well, in what you've just described, it's a possibility for sure, because I think the lesson I've learned is you need a very strong board to deal with a very strong, dominant CEO, and if there isn't some separation of the ability to serve as a director from your CEO, it sets up a potential or a dynamic for what's potentially happened here. So maybe there is a need to look at corporations that receive large funding from the government to have their directors selected in an independent fashion.
Do you see a role for the government or the ministry in this process?
Certainly if they chose to have it. It wouldn't be unusual to, say, have directors appointed by management board of secretariat or whatever, management cabinet board. That's a possibility.
What other governance structure do you see that would protect Ontarians, the public taxpayers, from this happening again? I'm going to the teacher sides of governance right now.
Well, one of the things I wonder about is it seemed to me, in hindsight again, that Ontario Air Ambulance was set up as a not-for-profit simply under a performance agreement to the government. And it didn't have the status of some of the other organizations so closely allied to the government, like a delegated authority. And maybe something as important as our air ambulance services should be more formally constituted, like a authority like the TSSA or the ESA or something like that. So maybe that's part of the puzzle.
So, following your train of thought and what my colleague was saying, so we need strong oversight from the government to the board, strong oversight from a strong board to its CEO and other officers. How were the chair, vice chair, et cetera, selected at Ornge?
Well, there certainly was a vote by the board of directors, a resolution to approve all officer positions, including chair and vice chair. As far as the slate put forward, we would receive a board binder probably a week ahead of the meeting, and there would be a list of candidates that we would be looking at and have the ability to say yes or no.
Was there ever election, as in two people running for chair?
No.
No, it was always a slate.
Besides the independent selection of governor or directors, what other mechanisms do you think would ensure that a board maintains its role at providing good oversight over, or a check and balance to a dominant CEO? Again, tapping into your teacher hat or turban, if you will.
Well, I'm still a work in progress trying to determine what would be the best model on this. I think, as I mentioned earlier, somehow I would like to see more of a proactive role rather than a reactive role, because my experience quite often seemed to be briefing as to what had happened. And we had our checklists of due diligence. You know, we'd hear from the medical advisory people as to whether there were any incidences and how they had been handled. And that's part of good governance, right, is understanding what's happened and taking appropriate actions to minimize them happening again. But at the same time, the 3.5, 4-hour meetings went by very quickly, and there wasn't a lot of time to just independently brainstorm. So either there has to be more board meetings at which time is set aside to brainstorm rather than to be reported to, or more board retreats or something to allow that activity to take place. The other thing, too, that I feel needs to be looked at is the issue of management and governance. Is some people think there's a bright line. You know, all of this falls in the management side of the line, and all of that falls in the governance side of the line. I personally no longer think there's a bright line. I think there's a line that moves depending upon what the issues are. And so basically having directors be more aware of what management is doing, even though management will argue they're in charge of day-to-day operations and the directors have oversight. But that oversight carries a supervisory role, and I think as a good supervisory organ, the board needs to be more in tune with where management is going.
And we'll move to the government. And Ms. Jessic.
Thank you. Our government has introduced Bill 11 as a potential solution for the oversight of Ornge as it currently exists. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with that bill, but it's essentially modeled on the Public Hospitals Act, so that there will be a similar type of ability to appoint members, as you've alluded to the board through the public appointments process. There is opportunity for the minister to order a supervisor into the organization, inspections, and we have some additional issues around whistleblower protection as well, and a complaint mechanism. Are you familiar with the Public Hospitals Act?
I am.
Yeah. So how do you feel about making the analogy here? This is obviously an essential service where health and safety of patients is at risk. Could you comment a little bit on that?
My understanding is Air Ambulance Ornge was considered a base hospital, so I like the analogy because when we were talking in the early days about what the vision was really a flying hospital. It wasn't just simply moving a patient from A to B, but treating the patient while on board the craft. So I think that analogy sounds quite appropriate.
Thank you. And I believe my colleague has one.
So I'm going to preface my question by saying that based on everything we know, probably getting fired from the board is a badge of honor at Ornge. So take that as you will. But that said, it's really important for me to really understand, given the pattern, given what happened with Enola, given that you yourself diagnosed the issue that this is a very strong CEO, needs a strong board, given the issues that all of us have raised around the fact that, you know, the person who is, it's a bit like me hiring my own boss. I mean, what credibility does that boss have if whether the boss continues depends on me? Given all of this, why did you not at any point, especially after you were asked to not continue, call up the Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care and say, listen, you know, we are here to look after your taxpayer dollars, but I'm a little concerned, I'm a little uneasy about the balance of power between the CEO and the board, given what's also happened, and I just want to flag this.
I never thought of calling the ministry. I think that there were no indications other than what I might express as a difficult personality. There were no indications of misuse of funds. There were personality issues, and that was apparent between Dr. Mazza and Enola. But if I had phoned up the ministry and said, you know, I just was asked not to stay on the board, and, you know, there's a difficult CEO in charge, but with a very impressive pedigree of having pulled all this together, being an emergency medical physician, being an MBA, and taking on a very big job, I'm not sure my credibility would have been very high, because it would have sounded a bit like sour grapes.
And I'll give you that, but it does go to the crux that this Chris Mazza was hiring and firing, and that has nothing to do with you individually. Just that's the crux of the problem, why the board had no governance, because they were serving at his pleasure. And that's what I'm wondering, why that was never flagged to the ministry.
Well, I can just tell you, when I was asked not to be on the board anymore, I didn't know really, other than Dr. Mazza didn't want me there, whether there were other issues that some of my directors may have had with me. Maybe they were frustrated with me asking questions. I don't know. So maybe there were reasons beyond personality clashes. But I don't feel that I had a critical mass to go to the ministry and say, heads up. I think it's easy to think that in hindsight with all that's
Fair
happened.
enough, yes. Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, very well. Well, thank you very much for coming in this
Thank you.
morning. It's appreciated.
Thank you.
And the committee is recessed until 12:30. Okay,